Our opening words this morning are from Robin DiAngelo, educator, professor, and author. She coined the term white fragility back in 2011, and her book of the same title has spent 102 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. We ignore the fact. Although we are taught that women were granted suffrage in 1920, we ignore the fact that it was white women who received full access, or that it was white men who granted it. Not until the 1960s, through the Voting Rights Act, were all women, regardless of race, granted full access to suffrage. Naming who has and who doesn't have access guides our efforts in challenging injustice. Dr. Robin DiAngelo.
Good morning. My name is Linda Leibel, and I serve as president of the Board of Trustees of the Universalist Church of Spartanburg this year. Thank you for joining us live via stream this morning. In cooperation with public health authorities, we have suspended all regular in-person church activities for the time being. As the pandemic continues, we understand that there is a desire to find ways to meet in person. We are a congregation and we must work together. Our highest goal is our care for one another. If you desire access to the church building or the grounds for any meeting, please contact the church office so that the board can vet your request to help you find the best and safest way to proceed in coordination with the whole congregation. Our care for one another and for our community only becomes more important in times like these. I encourage you to visit our website, uucs.org, for ways you can join in our work. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or any board member or any member of the staff. Our job is to serve you. We're glad that you've taken the time to connect with us this morning. Especially in times like these, we need each other. Thank you for being part of our congregation today. We are a people of faith and hope. Wear your masks. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us through this virtual medium so that we can continue being a community in faith and hope together, even in these times. Thank you so much for being a part of the life and work of this congregation. I want to thank Linda, our president, who just offered us announcements. Those of you who have been listening week after week will have heard a shift in the announcements regarding the church's work during the pandemic. Now, the church remains closed to all of our regular gatherings. But over the last weeks, and really throughout the summer, we have had a team of doctors and scientists and board members meeting and talking, and then referring material and ideas to the board to meet and talk and discuss back and forth. A group of about a dozen people wrestling with the ever-changing circumstances in which we find ourselves, with the dearth of good information and the awareness that some of the information we receive is actually falsified, trying to discern a way forward for our congregation. Above all, so we can fulfill our mission to care for each other and to care for our community. And what I want to praise in this moment is that wrestling, the long, difficult effort to work together, to be a team. To be coordinated is difficult. It's so much more gratifying in the short term to just go it alone. And we all have multiple pressures on us. People who want things from us and things that we want to offer each other, things that we just want to do. But the more we work together, the stronger we are. The stronger we are as a team, as a congregation, and the stronger we are as individuals, part of a larger system, part of a larger network, part of this community. So I want to thank the ad hoc COVID committee and thank the board and thank all of us for wrestling with each other, for speaking as clearly as we can our truth, with as much kindness as we can muster, so that we find our way forward together with strength. This church is doing amazing things, and we do them because we do them together. All this month, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, ratified on August 18th, 1920. Next week, for the culminating presentation and the high point of this entire month of presentations, perhaps even surpassing the unsurpassable embodiment of Susan B. Anthony by Mary Miles herself, Karen Mitchell will speak. Now, Karen is a longtime member of this congregation, a leader in our community in many, many ways, and crucially, the current president of the League of Women Voters, an organization that formed at the moment that the 19th Amendment was passed. When the 19th Amendment was ratified, one branch of the women's suffrage movement immediately reformulated into the League of Women Voters to advance the education and the cause of women's voting and education and women's rights. And their work continues with undiminished importance today. You need only read the headline news to see how critically important what they are doing is for us in this state and in our nation. The word suffrage is a strange word. We may hear in it the word suffer, but the oldest etymology that we have is from the Latin, suffragium, which means to support via ballot or via vote, to exercise the right of voting, actually to write down on a tablet what one's vote is. And in the medieval period, as Latin merged into vernacular languages, the word suffrage took on an additional meaning, to plea on behalf of another, even to offer intercessory prayer on behalf of another. And we can hear that connection, supporting someone, voting for someone, exercising the right of vote, and interceding on behalf of someone, whether we mean it religiously or not, to stand in support and intercession for someone, that justice be done. All month, we are celebrating women's suffrage and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We can see how radically transformed our society is 100 years later. I said to you last week that who I am today is not who I would have been then. And that is owing to the transformation wrought by the women's suffrage movement. As we light this chalice today, as we enter into this community of teamwork and coordination and wrestling together, a community of faith and hope and justice and liberation, I want to ask us as we light this chalice, this eternal flame, this light of reason and wisdom and enlightenment, to bring to mind all of the women who came before us, those in the suffrage movement and those not. Their suffering, the suffering of those in the movement fighting for their rights and for the transformation of our society, the abuse, the slander, the stone throwing, the mice throwing, the force feeding with tubes down their nasal passages and down their throats, the hunger strikes, the marches, the drives across country through deserts without roads and through snowdrifts, the abuse at home, the abuse in the political arena, the abuse as they march down streets, all that they suffered for us. And the women not in the movement, the women who preceded the movement, and all that they have endured. We know some measure of what they have had to live. All of the violence, all of the exclusion, all of the abuse. Bring to mind the women who came before us and what their lives have been and the power that they lived to survive and to fight for us all. Bring to mind their suffering and their intercession for us, their power exercised on our behalf to give us vision and a different way to live, to give us a future. As we light this chalice and gather as a community of faith and hope and justice and liberation, bring to mind and heart those women who have given us life and given us purpose and who have shared their power with us, that we continue the fight today. Thank you for being with us.
Our chalice lighting reading this morning is from Angelina Grimke Weld. In 1836, Angelina Grimke Weld wrote, "Appeal to the Christian women of the South," to urge white Southern women to join the anti-slavery movement. The misogynistic outcry from white Southerners over her vocal opposition to enslavement led directly to her sister Sarah Grimke's book, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes. If you suppose you can do nothing, I know you do not make the laws, but I also know that you are the wives and mothers, the sisters and the daughters of those who do. And if you really suppose you can do nothing to overthrow slavery, you are greatly mistaken. Angelina Grimke Weld, 1836. When Brandon and I first attended this church several years ago now, it was the covenant that made us instantly fall in love with this place. It was as if our hearts had spilled onto the page and we finally had the words to explain the inner desires of our deepest selves. Fast forward to now, and the more I get to know you guys and work alongside you, I see that these are not just words. They are lived out every day. This covenant is a living and breathing expression of how we care for each other and for our community. These words are who we aspire to be together. We strive for it, we hold each other to it, we fail at it, and then we keep trying together. I invite you now to reaffirm the promise we've made to each other and share in who we are as a congregation by stating the words of our covenant together. The words are printed in the order of service accessible on the homepage of our website every week. So from your couches, your back porches, your kitchen tables, or wherever you find yourself in this moment, join with me. We are a people of faith and hope. Together we covenant to strive to become our better selves, to honor both the critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to respond to systems of violence and oppression with a power of a love beyond belief. I invite you now to center and focus inward for a moment. Hold your joys and concerns in your heart, and then share them. Now is the time of the service when we actually encourage the use of cell phones. Under normal circumstances, using a cell phone during service would be frowned upon, but this is 2020 and nothing is normal. So get out your phones, send a text, post a greeting on social media, connect, cherish one another, even from afar. Know that your joys and sorrows still matter to us all.
we bring our gifts. I want to encourage you to go to our website, www.uucs.org. If you scroll just below this live stream, you will see a help button. Click on the help button and you will find a page that we update as frequently as we can remember. Ever renewed opportunities to serve in concert with this congregation, in coordination with this congregation during the pandemic. All kinds of ways that we can give, that we can share what we have, whether they be financial gifts or gifts of time, gifts of expertise and skill, gifts of energy, ways that we can share our gifts, share our power to help our congregation and our whole community, to help our nation as we navigate this very difficult year. A year of pandemic, a year of electoral politics, a year of protest, a year of consciousness and of struggle, a year in which over 170,000 Americans have not survived. A year in which we are fighting for life, the life of people we love and the life of our nation. If you look on that page, you will see particularly a section on advocacy. And I want to highlight also that the social justice work of this congregation is launching a voting rights effort already well underway, in which we would invite your participation. Whatever your gifts are, whatever it is that you would do, you can do something. Gender, age, race, income, class, none of these things take away the fact that we each hold power and that we can do something to nurture life in this moment as we enter into silence, shared silence for a time of shared power. Let me just repeat the words that Angelina Grimke-Weld wrote to the women of the South in the 1830s who found themselves with no overt political power, without the vote, without even the right to own property. The fundamental rights of being an individual in this country denied. And nonetheless, she said, if you really suppose you can do nothing, you are greatly mistaken. Let us share our gifts. Suffrage. Ida B. Wells was born into enslavement just before the Emancipation Proclamation. Black woman from the South who became a leading journalist and writer in the late 19th and early 20th century, and a key advocate for women's suffrage. Ida B. Wells is especially known for her journalism, her writing, and her advocacy concerning lynching and the program of terrorism that reigned in the post-Reconstruction South into the Jim Crow era. Fusing her work of advocacy for women's suffrage and advocacy for racial justice, just the right to live, just to live. Wells wrote, "With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. For if the strong can take the weak man's ballot when it suits his purpose to do so, he will take his life also. Therefore, the more complete the disenfranchisement, the frequent and more horrible has been the hangings, shootings, and burnings." The heart of and meaning of democracy is shared power. But that is not what the history of our democracy has often been. We must learn to see who we have been and what we have done, so that we can become our better selves, so that we can become who we are really meant to be. And we do that fundamentally in a democracy. We do that by sharing power. I want to focus today on this principle of shared power. And I want to urge us to ask, what can we do? What can we do? Following the lead of Angelina Grimke-Weld, every one of us has power, no matter our circumstance. What can we do to share power in our lives, to listen to one another, to empower one another, to work together across our disagreements and our very real differences in order to build a coalition? Not to act alone, but to work together to build a coalition in our families, in this congregation, in this community, in our nation, in our world. No scale too small, and none of us too small for the greatest scale. A coalition that works for the good of us all. Listen again to the words of Ida B. Wells, a woman who lost people she knew to lynching, a woman who was excluded on the basis of both race and gender, a woman who knew violence and the threat of violence. She knew terrorism and its effect on the body and the mind. And she knew the power of democracy, the promise of our democracy. And for her whole life, she fought for it. With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. For if the strong can take the weak man's ballot when it suits his purpose to do so, does that bring anything to mind today? Does that bring anything to mind today at all? If the strong can take the weak man's ballot when it suits his purpose to do so, he will take his life also. Therefore, the more complete the disenfranchisement, the more frequent and more horrible has been the hangings, shootings, and burnings. In March of 1913, Ida B. Wells was kicked to the curb. She had traveled to Washington, D.C. to be part of a parade, the Women's Suffrage Procession. The Women's Suffrage Procession was organized by Alice Paul, one of the leading women's suffrage activists of the era, a remarkable person, completely focused on her purpose and undaunted by any obstacle, a crucial part of this movement, a person almost frightening in her intensity, overwhelming and awe-inspiring, a person from whom we can learn in her precision and dedication and care. Alice Paul had orchestrated a massive rally, a parade, a procession of thousands and thousands of women from every corner of this country to march down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. on the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration as president. So many people gathered for this procession, first women to march, and then tens of thousands of onlookers to see what was going on and also to heckle it. So many people in Washington, D.C. gathered for this procession that when Woodrow Wilson arrived by train in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd to be welcomed on the day before his inauguration, the train station was empty. Nobody was there. And he asked where everyone was, and the answer was, they're at the march for women's suffrage. And if he didn't know it then he learned it quickly. Woodrow Wilson was facing one of the greatest challenges to his entire term as president. Ida B. Wells came with a delegation from Illinois to march in the parade. She'd been invited as a black woman and a leader in the suffrage movement, as a prominent writer and journalist of the era, invited to be a part of the march. And just as they were forming to practice the march, just as everyone was there to rehearse what would be done later that day, the delegation from Illinois, led by white women, told the women of color in that delegation that they could not march together, that they would have to find another place to march. Go to the back of the line. Rosa Parks indeed. The justification was that if the question of race was mixed with the question of gender and voting equality, there would be a political backlash and women would not win the franchise. And therefore, race and gender had to be separated and women of color removed from the prominent delegation from Illinois. Ida B. Wells protested as she would, and she was talked down. When the procession began that afternoon, she was nowhere to be seen. But as the march progressed, the mob around them grew angrier and angrier, began throwing things, stone and vermin and insults at the women, and began to jump the cordon that was in place to keep them separate, and began to push in against the women, so that women marching 8 and 12 across were forced into a single file line. Can you imagine the pressure and the fear, the intimidation tactics used to try to squelch their voice, to try to end their movement? And in the midst of that pressure and chaos and threat, Ida B. Wells was suddenly seen dead smack in the middle of the Illinois delegation. She had worked her way through that splitting, violent, angry mob, wending her way through all of that intimidation and threat to take her place in the delegation that had invited her in her march for women's rights and women's suffrage. Wells knew that there was a power in confronting racism and patriarchy together, that they go together, that one does not exist without the other. and that the franchise means life for all. She had seen what the disenfranchisement of black men in the South had meant under Jim Crow. She knew that it didn't just take away political power, it took away life. And she knew from her own life as a woman and as a suffragist the equivalent in the lives of women as well. And she would have none of it. She stepped into the middle of this throng, white women and white men fighting with each other over women's rights. And into the middle of it, Ida B. Wells steps. She acted intentionally multi-ethnic, intentionally multi-gender, interceding for the black men who had been disenfranchised in this nation. She was there as their intercessor, as their suffragist, representing as she did not only women, but also men, fighting back against the viciousness of disenfranchisement and the threat to life that it poses. If you think you don't have power, you are gravely mistaken. One woman, one small body, exerting powerful presence in that moment and into history. We remember that moment today. Her singular small self turning that whole crowd into a place of intersectional diversity and activism. And in so doing, Ida B. Wells underscored who really held the power, the political power. She brought to light that it was white men who were exercising violence and intimidation against everybody else. Her single, small, immensely powerful self revealed just by her physical presence and her courage the lengths to which white men would go in order to retain and isolate and intimidate and destroy through disenfranchisement. 100 years ago. 100 years ago. Make no mistake. If you see today white women campaigning on behalf of a black man who is running for elected office, especially in the South, especially, let's say, in the first state to secede from the Union, in a place of Confederacy and Jim Crow, you are seeing the power of multi-gender, multi-ethnic, intersectional coalitions that Ida B. Wells modeled. She showed us how to do it. We intercede for each other. And if you watch the reaction of opposing candidates, you will see the fear that multi-ethnic, multi-gender, intersectional coalitions strike in the heart of white domination. Make no mistake. There are many ways to tell the history of our country, and the history that we tell ourselves matters. We have a history of exclusion, violent exclusion, and of normalizing exclusion, so that anything that tries to change that exclusion, to bypass it, or to name it and call it out, is seen as criminal, seen as incorrect, seen as wrong or immoral, seen as worthy of violence. That is what happened to women in the suffrage movement. They were criticized for not being womanly enough, for not fitting gender stereotypes. And when they trespassed those stereotypes to picket, to march, they were physically attacked, treated with all the violence that we associate with domestic abuse, out in the public, in the open, by police, as well as by bystanders, by civil servants, people in the employ of the government, by elected officials themselves. That is our history. And we have a history of people determined and resilient to live, to fight for rights so that they can live. Not just to have rights, but to live by those rights. People willing to break norms, to trespass exclusion, in order to demand the right to live. And when they do that, they awaken the rest of us. They do us a service. As a people, they are working in coordination with us, calling our attention to what we have ignored, showing us the vital importance, the life-giving importance of greater and greater shared power. That is democracy. Given our history, when we form groups and make decisions on any level, no matter how small, in our families, in this congregation, in this community, in our nation, in our world, no matter the scale, when we form groups and make decisions, we must always ask, who are we forgetting? Who are we leaving out? What have we normalized and in that excluded others by the normalization? And in so doing, what have we lost? What have we threatened? Who have we hurt? In their lives and in ours? Who have we left out? Democracy equals shared power. Patriarchy, racism, heteronormativity, classism, xenophobia, all of these are attempts to normalize exclusion and to utilize disenfranchisement to assert one person's life over another's. They are about stealing power. But democracy equals shared power. When we slow down and work together, when we slow down to listen to each other and to value one another, even in our real differences and serious disagreements, when we build a story together, a story of what we have done and what we have left undone and what we can do together, when we do the work to find that our history is shared, even if our experiences are not, and that we are much, much stronger together. When we slow down and work together, we expand power for us all. And when we expand power for us all, we make life more livable for us all. People survive. This is not an overstatement. Disenfranchisement matters. People who have died in this pandemic know that the outcome of elections really matters for people's lives. If I sound dramatic, it's because death has been normalized. And by God, that excludes the people who have died. Make no mistake. Disenfranchisement takes lives. There is power in multi-ethnic, multi-gender, intersectional coalitions, especially coalitions that work for social and economic and political justice. Those mechanisms and points of access and ways of being a society that give us life, that just facilitate life. There is power in multi-ethnic, multi-gender, intersectional coalitions because they go right to the heart of normativity and exclusion and domination. The women's suffrage movement and the movement for racial justice began effectively as the same movement in this country. Abolition and suffrage emerged together. We see this embodied in the Grimke sisters, who in their fight for the freedom of enslaved peoples had to fight for their own right to speak. They were vilified and condemned and attacked. The buildings in which they spoke were literally burned to the ground to try to silence them. As women, white women, speaking on behalf of people of color and black men. But the movements split. They split over the 14th Amendment, which prioritized black men's right to vote, rather than joining together the enfranchisement of all. And in that split, the women's suffrage movement began to compromise in some of its aspects with racism and white supremacy in order to win women's right to vote. This was overtly stated both by suffragists, including Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul, and not just once, repeatedly over decades. And it was explicitly stated by politicians, and not just some politicians, by politicians from southern states who would not tolerate any possibility of returning the right to vote to black people that had been given in the 14th Amendment to men, black men, but then taken away under states' rights in Jim Crow. They were willing to compromise as long as the racial divide remained. Make no mistake, the photo that you can Google right now while I'm talking of Pitchfork Ben Tillman, South Carolina governor and then senator, Democrat, old school Democrat from the South, shaking hands with President Woodrow Wilson, president when the 19th Amendment finally passed. That photo shows them both talking to each other, shaking hands. That was not a benign conversation. The 19th Amendment raised questions that we know all too well today, of who was even a citizen, of who was blocked from the polls despite their constitutional rights, of what gender is and what gender normative behavior is, and of people feeling entitled to use violence against protesters when normative behavior is transgressed for the sake of political protest. And let me again just be really clear. Today, when we hear people comparing Black Lives Matter protests, which are just about black people surviving police brutality and racial injustice, comparing that unfavorably as uncivilized or violent, as wrong, in comparison with the women's suffrage movement, it's a false comparison. Those women destroyed property to make their point. And they marched nonviolently to make their point, as we have seen exactly 100 years ago today. And for both, this is a matter of life, of survival. And both transgress normative behavior in order to make a point. those women were ripped to pieces for what they did, violently treated for what they did, as we have seen in the streets today, as recently as last night. Make no mistake. And all of this shows us, then and now, the overarching downward-bearing pressure of white domination on both the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement. A pressure so great that it split them. It was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that many people guaranteed the vote, both in the 14th Amendment and in the 19th Amendment, in two constitutional amendments. I want to use profanity to say it. In 2 constitutional amendments. It took another 45 years for them to actually be able to exercise the right to vote because of laws in the states obstructing that right. And then, when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, and Martin Luther King Jr. launched the Poor People's Campaign to further the Civil Rights Campaign into the realm of economic justice, creating a multi-ethnic, multi-gender, intersectional coalition for political and social and economic justice, unifying poor people to fight for labor rights as a direct outcome of the civil rights movement. In 1968, the month before that campaign was to happen, planned, announced, strategized, Dr. King is assassinated. And Richard Nixon, that summer, accepts his party's nomination and launches the Southern strategy to terrify white voters in the South that black people are getting their power and white liberals are getting their power and women are getting their power. So you gotta vote for Nixon, a law and order candidate. And Nixon launched the war on drugs in 1971, criminalizing petty drug offenses and leading to the mass incarceration of more people in this nation than any other nation in the history of humankind, disenfranchising them, making them a cheap labor force for big business, splitting movements. Straight out of Ben Tillman's playbook. Make no mistake, the Russian interference in the 2016 election on social media was not primarily about tampering with voting machines, but about splitting votes, discouraging people from voting, telling them that they didn't have shared interest, splitting us into disenfranchisement. Because multi-ethnic, multi-gender, intersectional coalitions go straight to the heart of white domination. They go straight to the heart. And they build our heart. They go to the heart of all that would split us and tear us apart. And they build our heart for the democracy that we are meant to be. It is very hard to work together because of the pressure that is bearing down on us, that wants to split us. And we must constantly work on ourselves and the negative messaging and impatience that we've imbibed that tells us that we should just go off and act alone, do it our own way, shut people out that are in our way. That's not the right tactic. It doesn't work. It feeds the cause of the side that we're working against, we're trying to transform. This is why listening and humility and slowing down to find a better way together are so important. And I want to insist for us in our families and in this congregation and in this community and in our nation that we hold each other to account to do that. None of us want to do it because it slows us down. It can be so aggravating. People are so difficult. But help each other share power. Ask who we are leaving out. and do the hard work to bring them in. Because it goes straight to the heart. If we can scare Vladimir Putin, we can scare anybody. Make no mistake. It is so hard to work in coalition. It is so hard to hold us together. It is so much to handle. Because until we find each other and commit to each other, the effort of shared power is volatile. It can splinter in all directions at any moment. And the reason is that it is far more powerful than systems of domination and violence and oppression. It is the power of fusion instead of fission. Very hard to bring together. Very hard to contain. But the power of the sun when it connects. Share power and help one another gently and lovingly and straightforwardly over and over again in our families and in this congregation, in our nation and in our world. Share power. Share power. Share power. We have the perfect symbol of it. It was dedicated this week at this church. An image of women through history, standing up as best they knew how, standing together to lift us all in liberation. The Grimke sisters, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Maria Stewart, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Church Terrell, as best they understood under the immense pressure of white male domination, they shared their power with us. In their strengths and in their faults, showing us what small lives can do to create a real democracy. Share power. It will build our hearts.
As we extinguish the light of the chalice, a symbol of our Unitarian Universalist identity, hear these words from Angelina Weld Grimke, not to be confused with Angelina Grimke Weld, who we heard from when we lit the chalice. Angelina Weld Grimke, the great niece of Angelina Grimke Weld, was a biracial LGBTQ female writer whose plays and poems opened the way for the Harlem Renaissance. Her poem, At April, expresses the legacy of the Grimke family's fight for freedom. The beauty of the figures portrayed in the beautiful new Grimke mural within the grove of the trees at UUCS, and the possibility of liberation and joy for us all. At April. Toss your gay heads, brown girl trees. Toss your gay, lovely heads. Shake your brown, slim bodies. Stretch your brown, slim arms. Stretch your brown, slim toes. Who knows better than we, with the dark, dark bodies, what it means when April comes a-laughing and a-weeping once again at our hearts. Angelina Weld Grimke.
Ida B. Wells walked through a throng of thousands of yelling, screaming, intimidating people and stepped into the middle of a march from which she had been excluded, fusing the fight for racial justice and women's rights. And in that moment that we still see today, she changed our democracy. If you really suppose you can do nothing, you are greatly mistaken.
We have spent time together, and these holy moments give us strength to go down the winding road until we meet again. We have spent time together, and these holy moments give us strength to